The sun hung low and merciless over the Colorado Territory, painting the rocky outcrops and sparse grasslands in shades of burnt orange and dusty brown. It was the autumn of 1882, and the small town of Cedar Ridge sat like a weathered scar on the landscape, its wooden buildings huddled together against the endless expanse of wilderness that surrounded it. The air carried the perpetual taste of dust and sage, punctuated by the occasional whinny of horses tied to hitching posts along the main street. Cedar Ridge was like countless other frontier towns scattered across the American West, a place where civilization and wilderness met in an uneasy truce, where law was often more suggestion than fact, and where a man's reputation could mean the difference between acceptance and exile. The townsfolk numbered barely 300 souls, each carrying their own reasons for seeking life in this unforgiving land. Some came for gold, others for land, and still others simply to escape whatever ghosts haunted them back east. Among these souls was one who lived not within the town's rough embrace, but on its very edges, a man the townspeople had christened with whispered names and fearful glances. They called him the Monster, when they spoke of him at all, which was rare and always in hushed tones. His given name was Samuel McCade, though few remembered it anymore. What they remembered instead were the scars that mapped his face like dried riverbeds, the way his left eye drooped from damaged muscle, and how the right side of his mouth pulled into a permanent grimace that made even his attempts at neutrality seem threatening. Samuel's cabin stood a full 3 miles from town, nestled against the base of the mountains where the pines grew thick and the shadows ran deep even at midday. He had built it himself 5 years prior, after the incident that had transformed him from a returning soldier into Cedar Ridge's resident nightmare. The logs were fitted tight against the mountain winds, the roof pitched steep to shed snow, and a stone chimney rose straight and true. It was a solid, lonely structure that spoke of a man who expected nothing from others and offered the same in return. The path to town was one Samuel traveled only when necessity demanded it, once a month, sometimes less. He would appear at the edge of Main Street with pelts draped over his shoulder, deer, elk, sometimes bear. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned that speed meant less time for others to stare, less opportunity for confrontation. His transactions at Murphy's General Store were brief affairs conducted mostly in silence. Old Murphy would weigh the pelts, place coins on the counter, and Samuel would gather his supplies: flour, salt, ammunition, perhaps a new whetstone or length of rope. Never liquor, never anything that suggested comfort or companionship. The children of Cedar Ridge had grown up with Samuel as their boogeyman. Mothers would warn, "You mind your chores, or the monster will come down from his mountain." Fathers would point to the dark tree line when their sons showed defiance, saying, "You want to end up like him, living with the wolves and the dead?" The stories grew with each telling. How he had killed 20 men in the war, how he had turned on his own unit, how the scars came from a deal with the devil himself. The truth, as it often does, was both simpler and more complex. Samuel had indeed fought in the war between the states, serving with the 2nd Colorado Infantry. He had been at Glorieta Pass, had seen the elephant, as soldiers called experiencing battle, and had returned home like so many others, changed, haunted, struggling to fit back into a world that seemed to have moved on without him. The scars came from a Confederate shell that had detonated near his position, sending shrapnel tearing through flesh and ending his war in a field hospital where the surgeons had done what they could with what remained. But it was what happened after the war that had sealed his fate in Cedar Ridge. A dispute over cards in the Broken Wheel Saloon, too much whiskey flowing, and a man named Jake Thornton who couldn't accept losing to a mangled freak. Thornton had pulled iron first, there were witnesses to that, but when the smoke cleared, it was Thornton who lay dead on the sawdust floor, and Samuel who stood with a smoking Colt in his hand. Self-defense, clear as day. But Thornton had friends, had family, had a pretty young widow who wept at his funeral. The story twisted in the telling until Samuel became the aggressor, the killer who had murdered a good man over a few dollars. Sheriff Watson, a practical man who valued peace over justice, had suggested Samuel might find it healthier to keep his distance from town. It wasn't exile, exactly, but it might as well have been. Samuel had built his cabin, learned to live off the land, and slowly faded from man to monster in the collective memory of Cedar Ridge. On this particular October afternoon, as Samuel checked his trap lines high in the foothills, the stage from Denver was raising a cloud of dust on the eastern road. Inside, clutching a worn carpetbag and steadying a small boy against the coach's violent swaying, sat a woman who would soon challenge everything Cedar Ridge thought it knew about monsters and men. Her name was Elizabeth Hartley, though she had been Elizabeth Morrison for the 6 years of her marriage. The black crepe of mourning still clung to her dress, though it had been 8 months since the accident at the rail yard in Kansas City had made her a widow. 8 months of struggling to keep their small apartment, of taking in washing until her hands cracked and bled, of watching her savings dwindle while relatives suggested perhaps she should consider remarriage or maybe send young Thomas to live with his uncle's family in Chicago. Instead, she had taken what remained of their savings, purchased Coach Fare West, and answered an advertisement for homestead land available near Cedar Ridge, 160 acres under the Homestead Act, free to anyone willing to work it for 5 years. It was a desperate gamble, perhaps a foolish one. But Elizabeth had discovered that widowhood brought with it an unexpected steel in her spine. If the world wanted to see her broken, she would disappoint it. Thomas, all of 6 years old, pressed his face against the coach window, his eyes wide with wonder at the landscape rolling past. "Mama, are those mountains?" he asked for the 10th time, pointing at the Rockies rising like blue-gray teeth against the horizon. "Yes, sweetheart," Elizabeth replied, smoothing his unruly brown hair. "Those are the Rocky Mountains. We'll be living near them. Will we see bears?" The boy's voice held equal parts excitement and trepidation. "Perhaps," she said, though she hoped not. There were enough challenges ahead without adding wildlife to the list. The coach lurched to a stop in front of the Cedar Ridge Hotel and Boarding House, its wheels groaning a final protest. The driver climbed down and began unloading luggage with the casual disregard of a man who had made this run too many times to count. Elizabeth gathered Thomas and their meager belongings, stepping down onto the packed earth of Main Street. The town that greeted her was neither better nor worse than she had expected. False-fronted buildings lined the street like elderly men sucking in their stomachs. The hotel, Murphy's General Store, the Broken Wheel Saloon, a small church with a crooked steeple, the sheriff's office, all the necessary components of frontier civilization assembled with more attention to function than form. Men in worn denims and dusty hats paused to look at her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to calculation. A woman alone with a child was a rare sight, one that upset the careful balance of a place like Cedar Ridge. Elizabeth had arranged by letter to rent the old Pearson place, a cabin 2 miles south of town that had stood empty since its owners had given up and headed back east the previous spring. The land agent, a thin man named Holloway with ambitious whiskers and a permanent expression of mild dyspepsia, met her at the hotel with keys and directions that seemed deliberately vague. "You sure about this, Mrs. Morrison?" he asked, using the name she had given in her correspondence. She saw no need to complicate matters with the truth just yet. The Pearson place is, well, it needs work, and it's a fair piece from town. Might be better to stay at the boarding house until you find something more suitable. The advertisement said it had 4 walls and a roof. Elizabeth replied firmly, "That will suffice." Holloway's expression suggested he doubted very much that it would suffice, but he handed over the keys with a shrug that absolved him of responsibility. "There's a wagon and driver can take you out there. Jensen, he does hauling for folks. Course, getting supplies and such, that'll be on you to arrange after today." And so, as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Elizabeth and Thomas found themselves bouncing along a rutted track in the back of Jensen's wagon, their few possessions secured with rope. The driver, a taciturn Swede with hands like ham hocks, said nothing beyond grunting when she pointed out the turnoff Holloway had described, the Pearson place. when it finally came into view, was everything Holloway's expression had warned it might be. The cabin leaned slightly to the east, as if tired of fighting the constant wind. Gaps between the logs would need chinking before winter. The roof, while technically present, showed daylight through at least 3 places Elizabeth could spot from the ground. The door hung askew on leather hinges, and what might generously be called a garden plot was now a tangle of wild grass and volunteer aspens. But Elizabeth saw past the neglect to the bones beneath. The logs were sound, the foundation stones properly laid. There was a well with what looked like good water, and a small barn that might house chickens or a milk cow eventually. The land itself stretched away in gentle rolls, good soil from what she could tell, bordered by a creek that whispered promises of irrigation come spring. "This our new home, Mama?" Thomas asked, his small hand finding hers. "Yes," she said, squeezing gently. "This is where we'll make our new start." As Jensen unloaded their belongings with the same casual efficiency as the stage driver, Elizabeth noticed movement on the northern ridge, a figure on horseback, too distant to make out clearly, watching their arrival. The rider remained motionless for a long moment, then turned and disappeared into the tree line. She thought nothing more of it. These lands were full of drifters and hunters. She had more pressing concerns than curious strangers. That night, as she and Thomas made beds of their blankets on the cabin floor and ate a cold supper of biscuits and preserved peaches, she heard the first whispers of the wild wind that would become her constant companion. It sang through the gaps in the logs, carrying the scent of pine and the distant cry of coyotes. Thomas curled against her, seeking warmth and reassurance in equal measure. Elizabeth lay awake long after her son's breathing had deepened into sleep. Above them, through one of the gaps in the roof, stars burned with a fierce clarity she had never seen in Kansas City. The weight of what she had undertaken pressed down upon her like a physical thing. No family here, no friends, no husband to share the burden. Just her own 2 hands, a determination forged in grief, and a small boy who trusted her to make it right. She did not know that 3 miles to the north, in a cabin built tight against the mountain cold, Samuel McCade sat by his fire cleaning the rifle he had carried while watching the new arrivals. He had seen the woman and child, had noted the absence of a man, had recognized in the set of her shoulders the same stubborn refusal to bend that had driven him to these lonely heights. He did not know why the sight of them had stirred something in his chest. Some echo of the man he had been before war and scars and exile had rewritten his story. He told himself it was mere curiosity. Nothing more, after all. The Pearson place rarely held anyone for long. She would be gone before the first snow, back to wherever desperate hope had led her from. But as he banked his fire and prepared for sleep, Samuel found himself thinking of the way she had stood beside that ramshackle cabin, chin lifted, studying her new domain like a general surveying a battlefield. There had been no tears, no wringing of hands, just assessment, calculation, determination. Perhaps, he thought as sleep began to claim him, perhaps Cedar Ridge was about to meet someone who wouldn't scare quite so easily. The first month tested Elizabeth in ways she hadn't anticipated. Each dawn brought new challenges, gaps in the cabin walls that whistled like accusatory voices, a roof that leaked with even the gentlest rain, and soil that seemed determined to break every tool she put to it. Her hands, already roughened from taking in washing, split and bled as she learned the harsh vocabulary of frontier survival. Chinking, splitting, hauling, mending. Thomas tried to help, his 6-year-old enthusiasm lasting about as long as it took for the first blister to form on his small palm. Elizabeth fashioned him smaller tools from broken handles and set him to gathering kindling, feeding the chickens she'd bought with precious coins, and other tasks that let him feel useful without overtaxing his young strength. The townspeople watched her struggles with a mixture of pity and speculation. When she appeared at Murphy's General Store, her dress dusty and mended, purchasing nails and tar paper with carefully counted coins, the women would exchange glances that spoke volumes. A few of the bolder men would offer assistance, their offers laden with implications that made Elizabeth's jaw tighten. "Mighty hard work for a woman alone," Carl Brennan observed one afternoon, leaning against the counter with practiced casualness. He owned the livery stable and fancied himself something of a catch. Could use a man's hand around that place. I manage quite well, thank you, Elizabeth replied, not looking up from her examination of seed prices. Winter's coming on fast, Brennan persisted. Gets powerful cold out there, powerful lonely too. Elizabeth fixed him with a gaze that had frozen warmer men. Loneliness, Mr. Brennan, is preferable to unsuitable company. But it was Jacob Muller, who owned the small bank, who proved most persistent in his unwelcome attention. A widower himself, though 20 years Elizabeth's senior, he had decided she would make a suitable replacement for his late wife. His approaches were couched in concern and propriety, but there was something in his pale eyes that made Elizabeth's skin crawl. Mrs. Morrison, he would say, appearing at her elbow whenever she came to town. You must allow me to review your financial situation. A woman in your position needs guidance. My finances are my own concern, she would respond. But Muller was not easily deterred. One evening, as she struggled to repair a broken fence rail before dark, Muller appeared at her property uninvited. Thomas was inside, bent over the primers Elizabeth used to continue his education by lamplight. This is most inappropriate. Mr. Muller, Elizabeth said, not pausing in her work. I've come to make you a proposition, he said, dismounting from his horse with an air of ownership that set her teeth on edge. A business arrangement that would benefit us both. I'm not interested in any arrangements. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the pomade in his thinning hair. You're being foolish. A woman alone, a child to raise. You need protection. I could provide that. I need you to leave my property. Elizabeth's grip tightened on the hammer in her hand. Muller's face flushed. You can't survive out here alone. When winter comes, when your money runs out, you'll see sense. But my offer won't stand forever. Then we understand each other perfectly. Good evening, Mr. Muller. He left, but the threat lingered in the air like smoke. Elizabeth knew she had made an enemy, one with influence in town. But she had faced worse in Kansas City, creditors, her late husband's drinking companions, relatives who thought they knew better how she should live her life. She would not be bullied now. The next morning brought unseasonable rain, hard and driving from the north. Elizabeth woke to water dripping steadily onto Thomas's blanket. As she scrambled to move their bedding and position pots to catch the worst leaks, she heard an ominous rumble from outside. The creek, usually a gentle murmur at the edge of their property, had transformed overnight into a brown torrent. Fed by mountain runoff and the sudden deluge, it had jumped its banks and was advancing steadily toward their cabin. Worse, a section of the embankment had collapsed, creating a natural dam that was redirecting the flow directly at them. Thomas! Elizabeth grabbed her son, pulling him toward higher ground, but even as they scrambled up the slope, she could see it was hopeless. The water would reach the cabin within hours, and she had neither the tools nor the knowledge to divert it. That was when she saw him, a figure on horseback, watching from the ridge, the same silhouette she had glimpsed that first day. For a moment, neither moved. Then the rider spurred his mount down the slope, navigating the treacherous mud with practiced ease. As he drew closer, Elizabeth's first instinct was fear. The man's face, when it emerged from the shadow of his hat brim, was a landscape of violence. Scars pulled at his features, twisting them into shapes that seemed barely human. His left eye drooped, giving him a perpetual squint. The right side of his mouth was frozen in what looked like a sneer, but was simply damaged muscle. But it was his eyes, the parts undamaged, that held her. They were gray as the storm clouds, and filled with something she recognized, the careful blankness of someone who expected rejection. Creeks redirected, he said without preamble, his voice rough from disuse. That dam breaks. It'll take your cabin and maybe you with it. I can see that, Elizabeth managed, pulling Thomas behind her instinctively. The man, for despite the scars, he was just a man, dismounted in one fluid motion. Got tools in your barn? Some? Not much. He nodded curtly. Shovels will do. Boy can help." Before Elizabeth could protest, he was striding toward the barn. Thomas, with the fearlessness of childhood, piped up. "Are you the monster man?" Elizabeth gasped, mortified. "Thomas, apologize at once!" But the scarred man paused, looking down at the boy with an expression that might have been amusement on a different face. "Some call me that. You scared?" Thomas studied him with serious eyes. "No, sir. Mama says monsters aren't real, just people who do monstrous things. Your mama's a wise woman." He continued to the barn, emerging with shovels and a pickaxe. "Name's Samuel McCade. We need to break that dam before it builds too high." For the next 2 hours, they worked with desperate efficiency. Samuel directed their efforts with an economy of words, showing them where to dig, where to pile stones to redirect the flow. His strength was prodigious. Elizabeth watched him move boulders she couldn't have budged with a lever. Thomas darted back and forth, carrying smaller stones, his fear forgotten in the excitement of the crisis. When the dam finally broke, sending the creek roaring back to its proper channel, they were all soaked and mud-covered. Elizabeth's hands were raw, her dress ruined beyond repair, but the cabin stood safe, if somewhat damp around the foundations. "Thank you," she said, meaning it deeply. "I don't know how to repay—" No payment needed. Samuel was already moving toward his horse. "Check your roof. Those leaks will worsen." "Wait," Elizabeth started forward. "At least let me offer you coffee. Something warm." He paused, that gray gaze finding hers. "People in town won't take kindly to you knowing me. Mrs. Morrison. Best keep your distance. I make my own decisions about whom I know. Mr. McCade." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps. "All the same. Good day to you." He mounted and rode off, leaving Elizabeth standing in the mud with a peculiar feeling in her chest. Thomas tugged at her sodden skirt. "He's not really a monster, is he? Mama?" "No," Elizabeth said softly, watching the rider disappear over the ridge. "No, I don't believe he is." Word of the incident spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. By the time Elizabeth made her next trip to town for supplies, the looks had shifted from pity to something more complex. Women whispered behind their hands. Men's offers of help ceased abruptly. "Heard McCade was out at your place." Mrs. Garrett, the boarding house owner, said with false casualness as Elizabeth selected flour at Murphy's. "He helped divert floodwater that would have destroyed my home," Elizabeth replied evenly. "Still," Mrs. Garrett's mouth pursed. "Not proper. A woman alone entertaining such a man." "I didn't entertain anyone. He saw people in need and helped." "Very Christian of him, wouldn't you say?" The woman colored and turned away, but the damage was done. Elizabeth found prices suddenly higher when she shopped, credit less available, faces less friendly. Muller watched her with satisfaction, certain that social pressure would drive her to reconsider his offer. But Elizabeth had not survived widowhood and poverty to be cowed by small-town gossip. She continued her work, patching the roof with tar paper as best she could, preparing the soil for winter wheat, teaching Thomas his letters in the evening by lamplight. A week after the flood, she found a dressed deer haunch hanging from her porch rail at dawn. No note, no sign of who had left it. But she knew. The meat fed them for days, supplementing their meager diet of beans and cornmeal. She said nothing in town, but she made sure to leave a loaf of fresh bread on a stump at the edge of her property where the trail led north. It was gone by morning. As October wore on toward November, these silent exchanges continued. Game appeared when her supplies ran low. Once she found her wood pile replenished after a long day trying to repair the chicken coop. In return, she left what she could: bread, a jar of preserves, once a shirt she had mended after finding it draped on her fence, torn and bloodied. Thomas began watching for their mysterious benefactor, sometimes catching glimpses of movement in the trees. "There he is, Mama," he would whisper excitedly. But Elizabeth learned not to look too quickly, understanding that Samuel's help came with the price of distance. One evening, as early snow dusted the ground, she heard Thomas talking to someone outside. her heart leaping to her throat. She rushed out to find her son chattering away to Samuel, who stood at the edge of the property like a man at the border of a foreign country. "And Mama's teaching me to read about David and Goliath," Thomas was saying. "Do you know that story? Thomas, come inside," Elizabeth called, though not harshly. "But Mama, I was just telling Mr. McCade about—" "It's all right," Samuel said quietly. "Boys, no bother. Just brought this." He gestured to a small doe carcass. "Thought you might need it." Elizabeth stepped off the porch, moving slowly as one might approach a spooked horse. "Would you like that coffee now? It's a cold evening." He stood so still he might have been carved from the mountain stone. The scarred side of his face was in shadow, but she could see the war in his expression, loneliness battling with hard-learned caution. "People talk," he said finally. "They talk anyway." Elizabeth replied, "I've decided I don't much care." A sound escaped him that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been rusty from disuse. "You're a strange woman, Mrs. Morrison?" "Hartley," she corrected softly. "My name is Elizabeth Hartley. Morrison was a necessary fiction." He absorbed this information with a nod. Then, moving as if the action pained him, he stepped across that invisible border onto her property proper. "Just coffee," he said. "Then I'll go." But Thomas, with the innocent enthusiasm of childhood, had other ideas. As Elizabeth prepared the coffee with shaking hands, when had she last entertained a man who wasn't trying to intimidate or proposition her? Her son peppered Samuel with questions about hunting, the mountains, the tracks he'd seen in the snow. To her amazement, Samuel answered with patience, his damaged voice gentle when addressing the boy. He showed Thomas how to tell deer tracks from elk, drew patterns in the dirt with a stick, even smiled, a crooked, painful expression that transformed his face entirely when he finally rose to leave. Thomas had fallen asleep against his chair, worn out from excitement. Samuel looked down at the boy with something like wonder. "He's not afraid," he said quietly. "Children see more clearly than adults sometimes." Elizabeth replied, "They see what is, not what others tell them to see." Samuel met her eyes then, truly met them for the first time. "That's a dangerous thing in a place like this." "Perhaps, but I've found that living in fear is its own kind of danger." He left then, disappearing into the darkness as silently as he'd come. But something had shifted. Some barrier had cracked. Elizabeth cleared away the coffee cups with unsteady hands, her heart beating a rhythm she hadn't felt in so long she'd forgotten its name. Outside, snow began to fall in earnest, covering the scars of flood and toil with temporary grace. Winter was coming with all its challenges, but for the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, Elizabeth felt something besides determination. She felt hope. News traveled through Cedar Ridge like smoke through a drafty room, impossible to contain, changing shape with each telling. Within days, everyone knew that Elizabeth Hartley had served coffee to Samuel McCade, that her boy had fallen asleep in the monster's presence, that she had stood on her porch and watched him disappear into the night without calling for help. The reactions were swift and predictable. At Murphy's General Store, conversations died when she entered. Women who had previously offered grudging nods now turned their backs entirely, gathering their skirts as if her proximity might contaminate them. The men were worse in their own way, their expressions suggesting she had confirmed some suspicion about loose women who lived alone. "Shameful. Mrs." Garrett pronounced loudly as Elizabeth selected thread for mending. "What kind of mother exposes her child to such danger?" Elizabeth's hand stilled on the spool. "What danger would that be, Mrs. Garrett?" "You know very well what I mean. That man, if you can call him a man, is a killer. The scars alone tell you what kind of creature he is." "The scars tell me he survived something terrible," Elizabeth replied quietly. "Nothing more. He killed Jake Thornton in cold blood. I heard Mr. Thornton drew first." Elizabeth had done her own investigating. questioning old-timers who remembered the incident more clearly than the gossips. Mrs. Garrett's face flushed. No decent woman would defend such a man. But then, a decent woman wouldn't be living alone, taking charity from a monster. The word hung in the air like a curse. Elizabeth felt every eye in the store upon her, waiting to see if she would break. Instead, she placed her purchases on the counter with deliberate calm. "Mr. Murphy, please add these to my account." Murphy, caught between customer and community, hemmed uncertainly. "Well now, Mrs. Hartley, about that account. Is my credit no longer good here? It's just, folks are talking. Then folks should find more productive uses for their tongues." Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "My money spends the same as anyone's, unless you're refusing my business." Murphy wilted under her stare. "No, ma'am, that'll be $2 even." Elizabeth paid and left, her spine straight despite feeling the weight of every glare. But as she loaded her purchases into the small cart she'd borrowed, her hands trembled. The isolation she'd felt before was nothing compared to the act of hostility now directed her way. That evening, Thomas noticed her distraction. "Mama, why were those ladies mean to you today?" Elizabeth paused in her mending. She had hoped he hadn't overheard. "Sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand, sweetheart, like how they're afraid of Mr. McCade." Yes, exactly like that. Thomas considered this with the seriousness of a judge. "That's silly, Mr. McCade helped us. He's nice." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed softly. "He is." But the town's disapproval took more concrete forms than mere gossip. When Elizabeth arrived at the small schoolhouse to enroll Thomas for lessons, the schoolmarm, Miss Prudence Sterling, met her at the door with a pinched expression. "I'm afraid we're quite full at present," Miss Sterling said, not meeting Elizabeth's eyes. "Full?" Elizabeth looked past her to the half-empty classroom. "I count perhaps 15 students. Yes, well, we must maintain standards. Perhaps if your circumstances were to change." The meaning was clear. Denounce Samuel McCade, conform to the town's expectations, or Thomas would suffer for her choices. Elizabeth felt rage rise in her throat like bile. "My son's education will not be held hostage to small-minded prejudice," she said coldly. "Good day, Miss Sterling." She would teach Thomas herself, as she had been doing. But the rejection stung, both for herself and for her son, who had been excited about attending school with other children. Meanwhile, Samuel had retreated to his mountain solitude, clearly regretting his moment of weakness in accepting her hospitality. The gifts of game ceased. The silent exchanges ended. Elizabeth told herself it was for the best, that she had troubles enough without adding his burden to her own. But Thomas had other ideas. Unbeknownst to his mother, he had begun slipping away during his outdoor chores. Following the creek upstream toward the mountains, his path inevitably led him to Samuel's territory, where the boy's patient persistence gradually wore down the man's defenses. "You shouldn't be here, boy," Samuel said the third time Thomas appeared at the edge of his camp. "I brought you something." Thomas produced a slightly squashed biscuit from his pocket. "Mama made them yesterday." Samuel stared at the offering as if it might bite. "Your mother know you're here. She's fixing the chicken coop," which was true, if not exactly an answer. "You need to get back before she misses you." But Thomas had already spotted the trap Samuel was mending. "What's that for? Will you teach me?" And somehow, despite himself, Samuel found he was explaining the basics of trapping, showing small hands how to set the spring mechanism, warning about the dangers of carelessness. The boy absorbed every word with an intensity that reminded Samuel painfully of his younger brother. Dead now, these 20 years. These secret meetings continued throughout November. Thomas would appear like a small ghost from the trees, full of questions and that fearless curiosity that seemed to see past Samuel's ruined face to something beneath. Samuel told himself each time would be the last, but found himself watching for the boy, even preparing simple lessons: how to read weather signs, which plants were safe to eat, how to move silently through the forest. It was during one of these lessons that disaster struck. Elizabeth, finally noticing Thomas's extended absences, had followed him at a distance. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw where his path led. By the time she reached Samuel's camp, Mother's fury had built to a thunderhead. "Thomas Edward Hartley!" Her voice cracked across the clearing like a whip. Both man and boy jumped. Thomas paled at his full name. Never a good sign. Samuel rose slowly, his face returning to the blank mask he wore for protection. "Mama, you were disobeying and endangering yourself." Elizabeth's eyes blazed as she grabbed Thomas's hand. "We're going home, now!" "But Mama, not another word." She turned to Samuel, who stood like a man awaiting execution. "And you, how dare you encourage this? Behind my back, teaching him God knows what." "Survival skills," Samuel interrupted quietly. "Things he needs to know out here. What he needs is to stay away from—" She bit off the word, but it hung between them anyway. "From you, from danger, from monsters." Samuel's expression never changed, but something died in his eyes. "You're right. I'll make sure he doesn't come again." "See that you do." Elizabeth dragged Thomas away, her heart pounding with delayed terror. All the way home, she catalogued what could have happened. Thomas hurt, lost, or worse. The town already thought her an unfit mother. If they knew about this. But that night, as she tucked a subdued Thomas into bed, he looked up at her with eyes full of tears. "I'm sorry, Mama, he's so lonely, and he knows so many things." Elizabeth's anger cracked. "Oh, sweetheart, nobody's nice to him. Everyone calls him names. It's not fair." She smoothed his hair, remembering her own words about fear and understanding. "No," she admitted. "It's not fair. He's not bad. Mama, he's sad. There's a difference." From the mouths of babes, Elizabeth thought. She kissed his forehead. "No more sneaking off. If you want to see Mr. McCade, you ask me first." "Understood?" Thomas's eyes widened with hope. "Really?" "We'll see. Now sleep." But sleep eluded Elizabeth. She stood at her window, looking toward the mountains where Samuel kept his lonely vigil. She had reacted from fear of judgment, of loss, of the complicated feelings the scarred man stirred in her chest. But Thomas was right. There was a difference between bad and sad, between dangerous and damaged. 3 days later, she found herself on the trail to Samuel's cabin, a basket on her arm, and Thomas chattering excitedly beside her. The decision had not been easy, but the memory of the light dying in Samuel's eyes haunted her. She had added to his burden of rejection, and that knowledge sat poorly with her conscience. His cabin appeared through the pines like something from a fairy tale, solid, well-crafted, but utterly alone. No smoke rose from the chimney. For a moment, Elizabeth feared he had gone, driven away by her harsh words. Then he emerged from the tree line, rifle in hand, stopping short at the sight of them. "Mrs. Hartley." His voice held careful neutrality. "Mr. McCade." She lifted the basket. "I came to apologize, and to bring a proper meal, if you'll have us." He stood frozen, as if movement might shatter this unexpected vision. "The boys welcome, but you shouldn't. People will talk worse than before." "Let them talk. I've been poor and I've been scorned. I find I prefer the latter to the former, and I'll not add to the world's cruelty on account of wagging tongues." Thomas, unable to contain himself, burst forward. "Mama says I can learn from you if you'll teach me." And she brought chicken and dumplings and apple cake. Samuel looked down at the boy, then back at Elizabeth. Something shifted in his expression. A wall crumbling, perhaps, or hope taking root in barren ground. "Apple cake," he said faintly. "With cinnamon," Elizabeth confirmed, fighting a smile. I haven't had apple cake since—" He stopped, swallowed. "You're certain?" "I'm certain that kindness costs nothing and means everything. I'm certain that my son could learn valuable skills from you. And I'm certain that eating alone is a joyless necessity that need not be endured when there's an alternative." Samuel studied her for a long moment. Then, with the air of a man stepping off a cliff, he gestured toward his cabin. "It's not much, not fitting for a lady." "I'm no lady," Elizabeth said firmly. "I'm a homesteader, a mother, and a woman who knows her own mind. Now, shall we eat before the dumplings get cold?" As they entered the cabin, neat as a pin, she noticed everything in its place despite the bachelor solitude. Elizabeth felt the thunderclouds of town judgment gathering. By tomorrow, everyone would know she had brought her son to the monster's lair, had broken bread with the man they feared. But watching Thomas beam as Samuel showed him a map of the territory, seeing the wonder dawn on Samuel's face at the simple pleasure of company, Elizabeth found she truly did not care. Let them talk. Some things were worth the price of gossip. The consequences of Elizabeth's defiance came swiftly and without mercy. Within days of her visit to Samuel's cabin, Jacob Muller appeared at her property with 2 other men from town, Frank Garrett, whose wife had been so vocal in her condemnation, and Roy Hutchins, who served as Muller's enforcer in business matters that required a heavy hand. "Mrs. Hartley," Muller said, dismounting with an air of grim satisfaction, "I'm afraid we need to discuss your situation." Elizabeth, who had been splitting kindling, straightened but kept the axe in her hands. "State your business, Mr. Muller. The town council has met. There are concerns about the welfare of your son. The town council has no jurisdiction over my family." Muller's smile was thin as paper. "Perhaps not officially, but decent folks have a moral obligation to protect children from harmful influences. Your association with McCade has raised questions about your fitness as a mother." Elizabeth felt ice form in her veins, but her voice remained steady. "My associations are my own business." "Not when they endanger a child," Garrett interjected. "Taking the boy to that killer's cabin? Have you lost all sense? The only danger to my son comes from narrow-minded fools who would use a child as leverage for their prejudices." Hutchins, a man whose reputation for violence made him Muller's perfect companion, stepped forward. "Maybe you need a reminder about how things work in Cedar Ridge, woman." "That's enough, Roy," Muller said mildly, though his eyes glittered with approval. "We're simply here to offer Mrs. Hartley a solution. The bank is prepared to buy out her claim on this land at a generous price, enough to relocate somewhere more suitable for a widow and child. My land is not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. Consider carefully. Mrs. Hartley. Winter's coming. A woman alone, struggling to make ends meet. Exposed to dangerous influences, accidents happen out here. Terrible accidents. The threat hung in the cold November air like icicles ready to fall. Elizabeth's grip tightened on the axe handle. "Get off my property." Muller's face hardened. "You're making a mistake. The offer won't stand forever, and neither will the town's patience." They left, but Elizabeth knew it was far from over. That night, she barred the door and loaded the old shotgun she'd found in the barn. Thomas, sensing her fear, stayed close and quiet. The harassment began almost immediately. Elizabeth woke one morning to find her chicken coop destroyed, feathers and blood telling the story of her small flock's demise. Her fence rails were pulled down repeatedly. The path to her well was strewn with broken glass that could have lamed her or Thomas. At Murphy's store, her credit was suddenly terminated. "Orders from the bank," Murphy said apologetically, unable to meet her eyes. "Nothing personal. Mrs. Hartley." Other merchants followed suit. Elizabeth found herself effectively cut off from supplies just as winter began to bite with earnest cold. She rationed their flour, stretched their beans, made Thomas's clothes from her own worn dresses. Pride prevented her from going to Samuel for help. She had brought enough trouble to his door. But Samuel was not oblivious to her plight. He had survived 5 years of exile by knowing everything that moved in his territory. And the men who vandalized Elizabeth's property left tracks as clear as signatures. He also noticed her absence from town, the way smoke from her chimney grew thinner as she conserved wood. One evening in early December, as Elizabeth tried to make soup from nearly nothing while maintaining a cheerful front for Thomas, she heard a commotion outside. Her heart raced as she grabbed the shotgun, but it was Samuel's voice that called through the door. "Mrs. Hartley, it's McCade. There's been trouble." She opened the door to find him supporting a bloody figure, one of the men who'd accompanied Muller, Roy Hutchins. The man was barely conscious, his face a mask of blood and bruises. "What happened?" "Found him at the bottom of Widow's Canyon. Horse must have spooked." Samuel's tone was neutral, but his eyes held a warning. "Needs tending." Elizabeth understood. Whatever had actually happened, Samuel was giving her an opportunity. She helped drag Hutchins inside, sent Thomas for water and bandages, and set about cleaning the man's wounds with professional efficiency. Hutchins groaned back to consciousness as she worked. His eyes focused first on her, then widened in terror as they found Samuel standing silent in the corner. "You!" he gasped. "You tried to kill me." "Interesting claim," Samuel said mildly. "Considering I just saved your worthless life. You spooked my horse, made it rear. Your horse spooked because you were riding drunk through dangerous country in the dark, probably following someone. Maybe planning mischief." Samuel's scarred face could have been carved from stone. "Lucky I was hunting nearby." Hutchins tried to rise, but Elizabeth pressed him back down. "Be still, Mr. Hutchins. You've likely got broken ribs. Don't touch me, woman. You're in league with him." "I'm tending your injuries," Elizabeth said calmly. "Though, given you likely came here to do us harm, perhaps I should reconsider." Hutchins paled. Realizing his position, he was injured, alone, in the cabin of a woman he'd threatened, with a man everyone called a monster standing guard. His bluster crumbled. I won't say anything. Just let me go." "Oh, you'll say plenty," Samuel corrected. "You'll tell everyone how Mrs. Hartley showed Christian charity to a man who meant her ill. You'll tell them how she saved your life when she could have let you bleed out in the snow. And you'll make it clear that anyone else who comes here with mischief in mind might not be so fortunate as to have me nearby to rescue them from their own stupidity." Hutchins nodded frantically. Yes, I'll tell them. And one more thing." Samuel leaned closer, his damaged face terrible in the lamplight. "The boy, anyone who threatens the boy, anyone who even looks at him wrong, will answer to me. Make sure Muller understands that." When Hutchins finally limped away on his recovering horse the next morning, Elizabeth turned to Samuel with mixed emotions. "You didn't have to involve yourself. They involved me the moment they threatened you because of our association." He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "I'm sorry. This is my fault." "No." Elizabeth stepped closer, close enough to see the pain that lived permanently in his eyes. "This is the fault of small minds and cruel hearts. You've done nothing but show kindness." Kindness. He said the word like he was testing its shape. That's not what anyone else would call it. Then everyone else is wrong. They stood in the morning light, frost glittering on the ground between them, and Elizabeth made a decision that had been building since that first shared meal in his cabin. Slowly, giving him time to retreat, she reached out and took his hand. He flinched, as if burned. No one had touched him voluntarily in 5 years, not since the last army surgeon had pronounced him healed enough to travel. His hand was rough with calluses, scarred like the rest of him, but warm and solid in hers. "They call you a monster," she said softly, "but I'm not afraid." Something broke in his expression then, some last wall crumbling. His fingers curled carefully around hers, as if he held something precious and fragile. Elizabeth. Her name on his lips was prayer and plea combined. "Mama?" Thomas's voice from inside shattered the moment. "Is Mr. Hutchins gone?" Samuel stepped back, but Elizabeth held his hand a moment longer. "This isn't over," she said, and she wasn't talking about Muller's threats. "No," he agreed. "I don't believe it is." That night, as a blizzard swept down from the mountains, Elizabeth made a decision. She would not be driven from her land. She would not let Muller and his cronies use fear as a weapon. And she would not deny whatever was growing between her and Samuel. No matter what the cost, She had taken his hand and spoken truth. She was not afraid. Now she had to prove it. To the town, to Samuel, and most of all, to herself. The blizzard raged for 2 days, sealing them in a world of white. When it finally cleared, Elizabeth emerged to find her woodpile replenished, her broken fence mended, and a deer carcass hanging in her barn. Samuel's tracks led away through the snow, but she knew he hadn't gone far. He was done running, and so was she. Muller would return with new threats. The town would continue its condemnation, and winter would test them all. But something had fundamentally changed in that moment of clasped hands and spoken truth. They were no longer alone in their fight, and in the harsh mathematics of frontier survival. 2 people standing together were more than twice as strong as 2 standing apart. Elizabeth set about her chores with renewed energy. Thomas chattering beside her about the fort he wanted to build in the snow. From the ridge above, she knew gray eyes watched, protecting. Let them come, she thought. Let them all come. She was not afraid. Winter descended upon Cedar Ridge with a vengeance that year, as if nature itself sought to test the bonds forming between the outcasts. The snow piled higher than anyone could remember, turning the landscape into an endless white desert, broken only by the dark sentinels of pine trees. Elizabeth's cabin, already weathered, groaned under the weight of ice and snow. It was during the worst of the storms that their relationship deepened beyond mere survival into something richer and more complex. Samuel began arriving in the blue hour before dawn, moving through the snow with the silence of a man who had learned to be invisible. He would split wood, check the roof for dangerous ice dams, ensure the path to the well remained clear. By the time Elizabeth woke, evidence of his presence was everywhere, though the man himself had vanished like morning mist. At first, she simply accepted these gifts of labor, understanding his need to help from a distance. But as December wore on, she began rising earlier, timing her movements to catch him at his self-appointed tasks. "The coffee's hot," she would say, standing in the doorway with 2 cups steaming in the frigid air. He would hesitate, torn between flight and the simple human pleasure of warm coffee and warmer company. More often than not, company won. They would stand together on the porch, watching the sun paint the mountains pink and gold. Speaking of small things, the weather, Thomas's progress with his letters, the tracks of elk moving through the valley. It was during one of these dawn meetings that Samuel first spoke of the war. "I wasn't always like this," he said suddenly, gesturing to his scarred face. "Before the war, I was different." Elizabeth waited, understanding that words held back for years needed space to emerge. "Had a girl back in Illinois, Mary Catherine. Her name was pretty as a spring morning. We were going to marry when I got back." His laugh was bitter. "She took one look at what the Confederate shell did to me and ran. Can't say I blamed her. I'm sorry," Elizabeth said softly. "Don't be. If she'd stayed, I'd never have come west, never have found—" He stopped, but his eyes finished the sentence as they found hers. "Found what?" she prompted gently. "Peace," he said finally, though they both knew that wasn't the whole truth. These conversations became their ritual as December deepened into January. The bitter cold that kept most folks huddled by their fires became their private season, a time when the world narrowed to just the 2 of them and the boy who had brought them together. Thomas bloomed under Samuel's tutelage. The boy learned to read the sky for weather, to identify animals by their tracks, to move through the forest with something approaching Samuel's uncanny quiet. More importantly, he learned lessons no school could teach, about resilience, about seeing past surfaces, about the strength found in gentleness. One evening, as they sat by Elizabeth's fire while a blizzard raged outside, Thomas asked the question Elizabeth had been dreading. "Mr. Samuel, will you be my papa?" The silence stretched like taffy. Samuel's scarred face went very still, and Elizabeth felt her heart hammering against her ribs. "Thomas," she began, but Samuel raised a hand. "Boy," he said carefully. That's not a simple question. Your mama and I, it's complicated. Why? Thomas possessed the devastating directness of childhood. You care about Mama. She cares about you. You teach me things like a papa would. Why is that complicated? Samuel looked at Elizabeth helplessly. She took a breath and tried to explain. Sometimes, sweetheart, caring about someone isn't enough. The world has opinions about how people should be, and the world is wrong, Thomas interrupted with 6-year-old certainty. Just like they're wrong about you being a monster, Mama says we shouldn't let wrong people decide things for us. Out of the mouths of babes. Elizabeth thought for the second time that winter. She met Samuel's eyes across the fire and saw her own turmoil reflected there. Hope warring with fear. Desire fighting prudence. You're right, Samuel said finally. The world is wrong about a lot of things, but that doesn't make living in it any easier. Later, after Thomas had been tucked into bed, Samuel lingered at the door. The storm had passed, leaving the night crystal clear and sharp with stars. He's not wrong, Elizabeth said quietly. About any of it. Elizabeth. Her name was a caution on his lips. I know what the town thinks. I know what we risk. But Samuel, I've been a widow. I've been proper and respectable and alone. None of it filled the empty places. I can't offer you anything, he said roughly. I'm a pariah. Association with me has already cost you. You can offer me yourself, she interrupted. That's all I want. He turned to face her fully then, letting the lamplight fall across his scars without flinching. This is what you want. Instead of answering with words, Elizabeth stepped close and raised her hand to his face. He froze as her fingers traced the ruined landscape of his cheek, gentle as snowfall. No one had touched his scars since they'd healed. No one had looked at them without flinching. This, she said firmly, is the face of a man who survived hell and came out the other side, who shows kindness despite cruelty, who teaches my son to be strong and gentle both. Yes, this is what I want. Something broke in him then. She could see it in his eyes. Years of armor, carefully constructed, fell away. He caught her hand, pressing it against his scarred cheek. And for the first time in 5 years, Samuel McCade wept. Elizabeth held him as the strong hold the wounded, as the brave hold the broken, as a woman holds the man she loves when he finally lets her see his pain. They stood there in her doorway, blocked from the world by darkness and snow, and let something new be born between them. From that night forward, pretense fell away. Samuel still maintained his cabin in the mountains. Propriety demanded that much, but he spent his days at Elizabeth's homestead. They worked side by side, preparing for the rest of winter, building a life with careful hands and cautious hearts. The town noticed. Of course. The few times Elizabeth ventured in for supplies she couldn't make or trade for, the hostility was palpable. Women crossed the street to avoid her. Men made crude jokes just loud enough for her to hear. Muller watched from his bank window with calculating eyes, planning his next move. But there were small kindnesses too. Old Murphy slipped an extra pound of flour into her order when no one was looking. Doc Hillman's wife left a bottle of her famous cough tonic on Elizabeth's wagon seat. The Mexican family who lived south of town, outsiders themselves, nodded respectfully when they passed. One night, in late January, as Samuel helped Elizabeth patch yet another leak in her roof, she made a decision. "Marry me," she said. Samuel nearly fell off the ladder. "What?" "You heard me. Marry me. Make it official. Give them something real to gossip about." "Elizabeth, be serious." "I'm being serious." She steadied the ladder, looking up at him with determination. "I'm tired of dancing around what we are to each other. Thomas needs a father. I need a partner. And you need to stop punishing yourself for surviving. The town can hang. We'll never be respectable in their eyes anyway. But we can be a family. A real family. That's worth more than all their approval." Samuel climbed down slowly, his face unreadable. "You don't know what you're asking." "Don't I? I'm asking to spend my life with the man who saved us from the flood, who keeps us fed, who teaches my son honor. I'm asking to wake up next to the only person in this God-forsaken place who sees me as more than a widow to be pitied or possessed." She paused, vulnerability creeping into her voice. Unless you don't want—" He kissed her. It was awkward, unpracticed. He hadn't kissed anyone since before the war, and his scars made everything complicated. But it was real and warm, and full of promises neither of them had dared speak aloud. "Yes," he said when they parted. "God help us both. Yes." They were married 3 days later in Samuel's cabin, with only Thomas as witness and old Reverend Cooper from the Mexican settlement to perform the ceremony. Cooper asked no questions, blessed their union in broken English and fluid Spanish, and refused the coins Samuel tried to press into his hand. "Love needs no payment." The old man said, "Be happy. That is enough." As they walked back to what was now their shared home, Thomas between them chattering excitedly about having a papa. Elizabeth felt the weight of the town's judgment like a physical thing. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. There would be consequences. She knew. Muller would not let this stand. The respectable folks of Cedar Ridge would demand their pound of flesh. But just then, with her husband's scarred hand in hers and her son's laughter echoing through the pines, Elizabeth found she truly did not care. They had chosen love over fear, acceptance over approval, and family over the narrow definitions of propriety. Let the town talk. Let Muller scheme. Let winter rage. They had each other now, and that was worth any price the world demanded. The first signs of trouble came in early March, when the mountain snows began their slow retreat and the trails became passable again. Elizabeth was drawing water from the well when she spotted the dust cloud on the eastern horizon, too large for a single rider or even a small group. Her heart sank as she recognized the deliberate pace of men who meant business. "Samuel," she called, and he emerged from the barn instantly, rifle in hand. His ability to sense danger had kept them safe through the winter. But this was different. This was trouble riding straight to their door in broad daylight. "Take Thomas inside," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. "Bar the door. We face this together," Elizabeth replied, equally quiet. "Thomas, go to your room and stay there until we call you." The boy, sensing the gravity of the moment, obeyed without argument. Elizabeth retrieved the shotgun from beside the door and stood shoulder to shoulder with her husband as 8 riders approached their homestead. The group was led by a man neither of them recognized. Tall, lean, with the kind of pale eyes that looked through people rather than at them. He wore his guns low and tied down, the mark of a professional. Behind him rode faces they knew. Muller, Hutchins still bearing scars from his accident, Frank Garrett, and others from town. But it was the stranger who commanded attention. "Name's Jack Coulter," the pale-eyed man said without preamble. "Been hired by the Cedar Ridge Vigilance Committee to deal with undesirable elements." "There's no legal vigilance committee in Cedar Ridge," Samuel stated flatly. Coulter's smile was winter cold. "Legal's a flexible word out here. McCade, you should know that better than most." His eyes flicked to Elizabeth. "Ma'am, shame to see a woman of quality brought so low." "State your business and leave," Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Simple enough. The good people of Cedar Ridge want you gone. Both of you. The committee's prepared to buy out your land claim, generous terms. Considering—" "Our land's not for sale," Samuel said. "Everything's for sale. Friend. Just a matter of price." Coulter leaned forward in his saddle. "See, the committee hired me to solve problems. I prefer to solve them peaceful-like, but I've got other ways if needed." "You're threatening us?" Elizabeth's finger found the shotgun trigger. "Threatening?" Coulter laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "No, ma'am. Just explaining how things are. You've got a week to consider the offer. After that—" He shrugged eloquently. Muller couldn't resist adding his voice. "You brought this on yourself, Elizabeth, marrying this creature, flaunting your degradation." "What kind of example is that for the boy?" Samuel tensed. But Elizabeth placed a restraining hand on his arm. "A better example than cowardice and prejudice. Mr. Muller, now get off our land." Coulter tipped his hat mockingly. "1 week, folks. Be smart about this." They rode away, leaving a silence that pressed against the ears. Elizabeth lowered the shotgun with trembling hands. "We need help," she said. "There is no help. Not for us." Samuel's voice was bleak. "I know Coulter by reputation. He's killed a dozen men, all legal-like. Always finds a way to make it self-defense. Then we run? Where?" Samuel turned to her, anguish clear in his eyes. "This is our home, our stand. Running means they win." That night, they held a war council of 3 at their kitchen table. Thomas, mature beyond his years, listened gravely as his parents discussed options. "What about the sheriff?" Thomas suggested. "Sheriff Watson wants no part of this." Samuel explained. "He made that clear years ago." "The Mexicans?" Elizabeth shook her head. "We can't drag them into our fight. They have troubles enough." They were still debating when the attack came, not from Coulter, but from an unexpected quarter. A band of men, faces masked, rode whooping onto their property, torches blazing. Not to burn, not yet, but to terrorize. Samuel met them with rifle fire, carefully aimed to warn rather than wound. Elizabeth stood ready with the shotgun, while Thomas, disobeying orders, watched from his window with wide eyes. The riders circled the house, throwing their torches into the snow-melt mud, firing pistols into the air, shouting obscenities. Then, as suddenly as they'd come, they wheeled and rode away, leaving behind only churned earth and the acrid smell of smoke. "Coulter's giving us a taste," Samuel said grimly. "Next time will be worse." But the next morning brought an unexpected development. A lone rider approached from the north, not from town, but from the deep mountains. Samuel recognized him first, Moses Washington, a former Buffalo soldier who lived even further from civilization than Samuel had. "McCade," Moses said simply. "Heard you got trouble." "Moses." Samuel's surprise was evident. "Didn't know you were still in the territory. I keep to myself, like you used to." The black man's eyes found Elizabeth. "Ma'am, also heard you stood by this man when the whole town turned against him. That takes courage." "It takes love," Elizabeth corrected. Moses nodded slowly. "Same thing. Sometimes, I came to say you're not as alone as you think. There's others, outcasts, folks the town don't want, Indians married to whites, Chinese miners, Mexicans. Me. We've all felt Cedar Ridge's boot on our necks." "We're not looking to start a war," Samuel said. "War's already started. Friend, question is whether you fight alone or with others who understand." Over the next 3 days, they came, the invisible people of the frontier, the ones who lived on the margins. Not many, perhaps a dozen all told, but each with skills forged by survival. Juan Delgado, who knew every trail for 50 miles. Chen Wei, whose knowledge of explosives from mining could serve other purposes. Sarah Crow Feather, a half-Arapaho woman whose husband had been driven out for marrying her. They didn't come to Elizabeth's homestead. That would have been too dangerous. Instead, they met in the high meadows, planned in the shadows, prepared for what everyone knew was coming. Coulter, for his part, seemed content to wait, letting fear do his work, but Muller grew impatient. On the 5th day, he arrived at the homestead with a new offer. "Be reasonable," he urged from a safe distance, having learned not to come too close. "Take the money. Start fresh somewhere else." "Why put the boy through what's coming?" "Because running teaches him that might makes right." Elizabeth called back. "That bullies win if they're loud enough. I'll not have him learn that lesson." Muller's face darkened. "You're a fool, woman. Coulter's killed women before. He's got no scruples about it." "Then he and I have something in common," Elizabeth replied. "Neither do I, when it comes to protecting my family." That night, Samuel sat sharpening his knife by the fire while Elizabeth mended clothes, domestic tranquility shadowed by approaching storm. Thomas played on the floor with wooden soldiers Samuel had carved for him. "I'm sorry." Samuel said suddenly. "For bringing this on you. If I'd stayed away, then I'd have faced Muller's harassment alone." Elizabeth interrupted. "And Thomas would have grown up without a father's guidance, and you'd have died alone on your mountain, thinking yourself unworthy of love." She set aside her sewing and moved to kneel beside his chair. "Whatever comes, we face it as a family. No regrets." He cupped her face in his scarred hands. "How did I deserve you?" "You didn't," she said with a small smile. "I'm a gift. Best appreciate me properly. Despite everything." He laughed, the sound rusty but real. Thomas looked up from his play, grinning to see his parents happy. It was their last peaceful evening. The attack came at dawn. Coulter was too professional to give them the advantage of darkness. He brought 15 men, including several Elizabeth didn't recognize, hired guns from other towns, men who wouldn't hesitate at whatever orders they were given. But Coulter had made one miscalculation. He expected to find 3 people cowering in a cabin. Instead, as his men surrounded the homestead, they found themselves caught in a crossfire from the ridges above. Moses Washington's buffalo gun boomed like thunder. Chen Wei's carefully placed charges created confusion and fear. Juan Delgado's knowledge of the terrain let the defenders appear and disappear like ghosts. Samuel fought with the cold efficiency of a man defending his home. Elizabeth discovered she could shoot to kill when her family was threatened. Even Thomas, hidden in the root cellar with Sarah Crowfeather, played his part by reloading weapons with fingers that barely trembled. The battle was fierce but brief. Coulter's men, expecting easy prey, found themselves outmaneuvered and outfought. When Coulter himself fell, wounded by Moses's sharpshooting, the remaining attackers broke and fled. But victory came at a cost. Chen Wei lay dead, his sacrifice allowing others to live. Juan bled from a shoulder wound, and Samuel had taken a bullet in the leg that would leave him limping for weeks. As Elizabeth bound her husband's wound, she saw riders approaching from town. Not attackers this time, but Sheriff Watson and a federal marshal who'd arrived on the morning stage. "Heard there was trouble," Watson said unnecessarily, surveying the battlefield. "Coulter, wounded, alive." Moses indicated where the gunman lay groaning. "Others run off." The federal marshal, a competent-looking man named Harris, dismounted and studied the scene. "Someone want to explain what happened here?" Muller, who had wisely stayed back from the fighting, rushed forward. "These people attacked us. We came to serve legal papers, and legal papers don't usually require 15 armed men," Marshal Harris observed dryly, "including Jack Coulter, who's wanted in 3 territories." He turned to Elizabeth and Samuel. "Your version?" Elizabeth straightened, blood on her dress and steel in her voice. "We defended our home against hired killers, with the help of our neighbors." "Neighbors?" Muller sputtered. "These aren't neighbors, they're Americans." Moses Washington interrupted quietly. "Free Americans defending other free Americans? That's still legal in this territory?" "Marshal?" Harris studied them all. The white woman and her scarred husband, the black soldier, the Mexican vaquero, the Chinese miner's body, the half-Indian woman emerging from the cellar with a child. His expression was unreadable. "Seems to me," he said finally, "this was a clear case of self-defense against criminal attack. I'll be taking Coulter and any of his men we can round up back for trial. As for the rest," he looked directly at Muller, "I'd suggest folks find more peaceful ways to resolve their differences." Muller's face went purple, but he knew better than to argue with a federal marshal. As the lawmen organized the removal of wounded and dead, he managed one last threat. "This isn't over," he hissed at Elizabeth. "You've won nothing." "We've won the right to stay on our land," she replied. "That's everything." As the sun climbed higher, painting the mountains gold, the defenders gathered to bury Chen Wei and tend their wounds. They had won this battle, but everyone knew Muller was right in one sense. It wasn't over. The town's prejudice remained. The challenges of frontier life continued. But something had changed. The outcasts had found each other, had discovered strength in unity, and at the center of it stood a scarred man and the woman who had taken his hand, proving that love could indeed conquer fear. "What now?" Thomas asked, emerging from the cellar to survey his transformed world. Samuel, leaning on Elizabeth for support, ruffled the boy's hair. "Now we rebuild, we go on, we live. Together," Elizabeth added. "Together," the others echoed, and in that word was both promise and power. The aftermath of the battle brought an uneasy peace to Cedar Ridge. Marshal Harris's intervention had forced a temporary cessation of hostilities, but the underlying tensions remained like embers waiting for fresh wind. Muller retreated to his bank, nursing his humiliation and plotting revenge through more subtle means. The town itself seemed to hold its breath, uncertain how to react to the dramatic shift in power dynamics for Elizabeth and Samuel. The days following the confrontation were filled with the quiet work of healing and rebuilding. Samuel's leg wound, while not life-threatening, kept him confined to the cabin for the first week. He chafed at the inactivity, but Elizabeth proved an implacable nurse. "You'll stay in that bed until Doc Hillman says otherwise," she declared, ignoring his protests. "We didn't survive all this for you to lose the leg to infection from your stubbornness." It was during this enforced stillness that Marshal Harris paid them an unexpected visit. He arrived alone, his weathered face thoughtful as he accepted Elizabeth's offer of coffee. "I've been doing some investigating," he began without preamble. "Into that old killing, Jake Thornton." Samuel tensed, but Harris raised a calming hand. "Found some interesting facts. Witnesses who were too scared to talk before. Seems Thornton had a reputation for violence when he drank. Also seems he owed considerable money to various people, including Muller." "What are you saying? Marshall?" Elizabeth asked carefully. "I'm saying that sometimes the truth takes a while to surface. I've spoken to Judge Carlton over in Denver. He's willing to review the case, maybe issue a formal clearing of Mr. McCade's name." Samuel's scarred face showed a complexity of emotions. "After all this time, why?" "Because justice delayed doesn't have to be justice denied," Harris replied. "And because a man who inspires such loyalty," he gestured toward the window, where Moses and Juan could be seen working on fence repairs, "deserves to have his name cleared." The formal hearing was set for 3 weeks hence. Word spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire, dividing the town even further. Some, tired of Muller's heavy-handed control, began to speak up about things they'd seen and heard that night 5 years ago. Others, bound by fear or obligation, maintained their silence. It was Mrs. Garrett who provided the most unexpected testimony. She arrived at Elizabeth's door on a cold March evening, her usual rigid propriety cracked by something that might have been conscience. "I need to speak with your husband," she said, not quite meeting Elizabeth's eyes. Samuel, now mobile with a cane Samuel had carved, joined them in the parlor. "Mrs." Garrett sat ramrod straight, her hands twisted in her lap. "Frank doesn't know I'm here," she began. Well, that doesn't matter. I was there that night, at the Broken Wheel. I saw what happened." "You were in the saloon?" Elizabeth couldn't hide her surprise. Color stained the older woman's cheeks. "I was looking for Frank. He'd been drinking, gambling. I stayed in the shadows, didn't want to embarrass him by dragging him home. But I saw it all. Jake Thornton was drunk, mean drunk. He'd lost badly at cards. Accused your husband of cheating. When Mr. McCade tried to leave, Thornton blocked his way. Why didn't you speak up before?" Samuel's voice held no accusation, only weary curiosity. "Because my husband owed Muller money, because I was afraid, because it was easier to let people believe." She trailed off, then lifted her chin with something like her old defiance. "I've been a coward, but watching you stand up to them, seeing that even outcasts can find courage, I won't be a coward anymore." Her testimony at the hearing proved decisive. Combined with others who finally found their voices, the truth emerged in full. Jake Thornton had drawn first, had fired first, had died because he couldn't accept losing to a man he deemed inferior. Samuel had acted in clear self-defense. Judge Carlton's verdict was unequivocal. Samuel McCade, I find that you acted within your rights and within the law. Furthermore, I find that you have been grievously wronged by rumor and prejudice. Let the record show that you are an innocent man. An innocent man? The words seemed to hang in the air like something foreign. Samuel sat very still, Elizabeth's hand tight in his, as if movement might shatter this unexpected redemption. But clearing Samuel's name was only part of the battle. Mueller, while weakened, wasn't finished. He began calling in loans, raising interest rates, making life difficult for anyone who showed sympathy to the McCades. Several families found themselves facing foreclosure. The divide in Cedar Ridge deepened. It was Thomas, in his innocent wisdom, who suggested the solution. Why don't we help them like Mr. Moses and the others helped us? And so began what the town would later call the Alliance of the Outcasts, though they simply called it neighboring. Sarah Crowfeather organized the women to share preserving techniques that stretched food supplies. Juan and his cousins helped bring in harvests for families whose men were injured or ill. Moses taught hunting skills to boys whose fathers had never learned. Even Samuel, despite his continuing recovery, shared his knowledge of survival. Elizabeth found herself at the center of it all, coordinating efforts, mediating disputes, and slowly earning a different kind of respect. Not the shallow approval of social conformity, but the deeper regard earned through action and sacrifice. The confrontation with Mueller came to a head in April, when he attempted to foreclose on the widow Martinez's small farm. The widow, who had 5 children and nowhere else to go, had missed 2 payments while nursing her eldest through pneumonia. A crowd gathered at the courthouse steps where the auction was to be held. Mueller stood with Sheriff Watson and the auctioneer, confident in the law's protection. What he hadn't expected was the unified response of the community's outcasts and their growing number of allies. "I bid $1, Moses Washington announced when the auction began. $2, Mueller countered irritably. $1, Juan Delgado said firmly. "You can't bid backwards," Mueller protested. $1, Sarah Crowfeather stated. Soon the entire crowd was chanting $1, making it impossible for the auctioneer to continue. Mueller's face grew purple with rage. "This is illegal. Sheriff, arrest them!" Watson, who had been doing his own soul-searching since the Coulter incident, shook his head slowly. "Don't see any law being broken. Mr. Mueller, folks have a right to bid." In the end, Moses's bid of $1 stood as the only valid offer. He immediately signed the deed back to Widow Martinez, asking only that she pay what she could, when she could. The crowd dispersed peacefully, but the message was clear. The old order was changing. That evening, as Elizabeth and Samuel sat on their porch watching Thomas play with the Martinez children, a buggy approached. To their surprise, it carried Judge Carlton and Marshal Harris. "We need to talk," the judge said without preamble, "about the future of Cedar Ridge." They gathered in the parlor, the same room where Mrs. Garrett had unburdened her conscience. The judge, a man who had seen too many frontier towns tear themselves apart, was blunt in his assessment. This town is at a crossroads. It can continue down the path of division and hatred, or it can choose something better. You two, he looked at Samuel and Elizabeth, have become symbols of something larger than yourselves. "We never asked for that," Samuel said quietly. "Leadership rarely asks permission," Harris observed. "The question is, what will you do with the influence you've gained?" Elizabeth and Samuel exchanged glances, years of understanding compressed into that single look. It was Elizabeth who spoke. "We want to build, not tear down. Create a place where Thomas and children like him can grow up without the poison of prejudice. But we can't do it alone." "You won't be alone," Judge Carlton assured them. "I'm recommending that the territorial governor appoint a new town council, one that represents all of Cedar Ridge's citizens. Mr. McCade, your name has been suggested for inclusion." Samuel's shock was evident. That's not possible. The town would never accept." "The town is changing," Harris interrupted. "The question is whether you'll help guide that change or let others shape it." After the officials left, Elizabeth found Samuel standing outside, staring at the stars. She slipped her arm through his, feeling the solid warmth of him. From monster to councilman, she said softly. Quite a journey. I don't know if I can do it, he admitted. Facing them every day, sitting in judgment. You won't be sitting in judgment. You'll be offering wisdom earned through pain. Who better to help heal this town than someone who knows the cost of its cruelty? He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. How do you always know what to say? Practice, she replied, feeling him smile against her temple. And faith in you, in us, in the possibility of change. Inside, Thomas called out in his sleep. Some minor nightmare quickly soothed. They stood together in the darkness, no longer outcasts, but architects of a new future. The road ahead remained uncertain, fraught with challenges and residual prejudices that would take years to fully overcome. But they had proven something important. Love could indeed conquer fear. Unity could overcome division. And even the most scarred hearts could find healing in the courage to trust again. The monster of Cedar Ridge was dead, a myth dissolved by truth and compassion. In his place stood Samuel McCade, husband, father, and reluctant leader in a community learning that strength came not from exclusion but from embrace. As they turned to go inside, a wolf howled in the distant mountains. Not a threat, but a reminder that the wild still existed, would always exist, at the edges of civilization, but wilderness, they had learned, wasn't something to be feared. Sometimes it was where you found your truest self. Sometimes it was where love bloomed strongest. And sometimes, just sometimes, it was where monsters became men and outcasts became family. Spring came to Colorado Territory with a gentleness that year, as if nature itself recognized the need for healing after a harsh winter of both weather and human conflict. The mountains shed their snowcaps gradually, sending clear water down to the valley where Elizabeth and Samuel had chosen to make their stand. The decision to leave Elizabeth's original homestead hadn't been easy, but practical necessity won out. The old cabin, battered by weather and conflict, needed more repair than made sense. Instead, they chose to build anew on a piece of land that straddled both properties, Samuel's mountain refuge and Elizabeth's valley claim. It was symbolic. Thomas had declared with 7-year-old wisdom of bringing together high and low, hidden and visible, past and future. The building of their new home became a community effort. Moses Washington proved a master craftsman, teaching others as they worked. Juan Delgado's family provided adobe bricks for the foundation, a technique that would keep the house cool in summer and warm in winter. Sarah Crowfeather organized the women to weave blankets and prepare stores for the new household. Even some townspeople, those whose hearts had begun to thaw, appeared with donations of lumber or labor. Sheriff Watson himself showed up one morning, badge gleaming in the spring sun. Figured you could use an extra pair of hands, he said gruffly, not quite meeting Samuel's eyes. It was as close to an apology as the lawman could manage for years of looking the other way. As the house rose from the earth, strong and welcoming, so too did new relationships form. Mrs. Garrett, liberated by her confession, became an unexpected ally. She arrived one afternoon with a wagon full of furniture. Frank's left me, she announced with more relief than sorrow. Couldn't stand that I'd testified for you. Took himself off to California to find gold. He says, good riddance. She gestured to the furniture. These pieces deserve a home where there's love instead of just propriety. Elizabeth embraced the older woman, feeling the trembling in her thin frame. You'll always be welcome here. Margaret. Margaret, Mrs., Garrett repeated wonderingly. Haven't been called by my given name in 20 years. Yes, I think I'd like to be Margaret again. The house was completed by May, just in time for an event that would have been unthinkable a year earlier, Thomas's birthday party, to which children from across the community were invited. Mexican children, white children, Sarah Crowfeather's mixed heritage sons, even Chen Wei's nephew, who had arrived from San Francisco to settle his uncle's affairs and decided to stay. Elizabeth watched from the porch as the children played together, their laughter carrying on the clean mountain air. Samuel stood beside her, his hand finding hers with the ease of long practice. Look at them, she murmured. They don't see the differences their parents taught them to see? Give them time, Samuel said. but his scarred face held a smile. The world has a way of teaching division. Then we'll have to teach harder, Elizabeth replied firmly. Love harder, hope harder. The town council meetings, once Samuel officially joined, were exercises in patience and diplomacy. Muller still held his seat, still commanded loyalty from some, but his power was waning. The territorial governor's mandate for inclusive representation meant that Moses, Juan, and even Sarah Crowfeather now had voices in town governance. The first major test came when a new vein of silver was discovered in the mountains, on land traditionally used by the Arapaho for hunting. The old way would have been simple. Drive off the Indians. Let white prospectors claim everything. But the new council, led by Samuel's quiet insistence on justice, forged a different path. We share, he said simply when Muller protested. The Arapaho get rights to their traditional hunting grounds. Prospectors can work designated areas. The town takes a percentage of fines to fund a proper school, one that welcomes all children. You're talking about giving savages equal rights with white men, Muller sputtered. I'm talking about recognizing that we all bleed red. Samuel replied, his damaged voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. I've seen enough blood spilled to know it all looks the same on the ground. The compromise held, though not without grumbling. But when the first silver revenues built a new schoolhouse with Sarah Crowfeather as one of the teachers, even some skeptics began to see the wisdom in cooperation. Life settled into new rhythms. Samuel found that his skills in hunting and tracking translated well to his role as a peace officer, working alongside Sheriff Watson to maintain order with justice rather than fear. Elizabeth established a lending library in their home, teaching anyone who wanted to learn to read. Thomas grew like a reed, absorbing lessons from his varied community of teachers. One autumn evening, as the aspens turned gold on the mountainsides, Elizabeth found Samuel in what they'd come to call his thinking spot, a bench behind their house facing the peaks. His appointment to the Territorial Committee on Veteran Affairs had brought new responsibilities, new challenges. They want me to speak, he said without preamble, at the dedication of the War Memorial in Denver, about healing, moving past old wounds. Elizabeth settled beside him, saying nothing. She'd learned when to speak and when to simply be present. How can I talk about healing? Samuel continued, touching his scarred face unconsciously. When I wear my wounds for all to see. Maybe that's exactly why you should speak, Elizabeth suggested gently. Because your wounds are visible. Because you've learned to live with them, not in spite of them, but through them. Because you found love and purpose not by hiding, but by allowing yourself to be seen. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, will you come with me? Try to keep me away. The speech, when delivered, was simple and powerful. Samuel spoke of wounds both seen and unseen, of the courage required not just in battle but in the harder fight for peace afterward. He spoke of a woman who had looked past scars to see the man beneath, of a community that had learned to build bridges from its very divisions. His words, halting at times but genuine throughout, brought tears to many eyes and changed more than a few hearts. Muller left Cedar Ridge that winter. His bank sold to a consortium that included Moses Washington as a partner. Some said he went to San Francisco, others to Chicago. Elizabeth suspected he'd simply found a new town where his old methods might still work, and pitied those who would have to learn the lessons Cedar Ridge had paid for in pain. Spring came round again, and with it the anniversary of that first meeting in the flood. Samuel and Elizabeth stood by the creek, now running peacefully in its proper banks, watching Thomas teach the younger children how to skip stones. Did you imagine this? Elizabeth asked, when you saved us that day. I imagine nothing, Samuel admitted. I was empty then, just existing. You gave me reason to live again. We gave each other reason, she corrected, leaning into his strength. And look what we've built from that gift. Their home stood strong against the mountains, smoke rising peacefully from the chimney, gardens spread out in neat rows, promising summer's bounty. Chickens pecked in the yard, a milk cow lowed in the barn, and horses grazed in the pasture, all the signs of a prosperous homestead. But more than that, paths led to their door from all directions. The path from town was well worn now, no longer traveled in fear or secrecy, but in friendship. Children's laughter rang out regularly. Neighbors came to share meals, seek advice, or simply enjoy the peace of a place where all were welcome. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Elizabeth and Samuel turned toward home. Thomas ran ahead, calling something about helping with dinner. They followed more slowly. Hands joined, no words needed. They had traveled far from that day when a widow had looked at a scarred man and declared her lack of fear. Through flood and drought, prejudice and acceptance, isolation and community, they had built something larger than themselves, a love that had indeed conquered fear, a family that extended beyond blood, a home that stood as testimony to the power of choosing hope over hate. In the growing dusk, a wolf called from the high peaks, not a threat now, but a reminder of the wild beauty surrounding them. Samuel squeezed Elizabeth's hand, and she squeezed back, and together they walked toward the warm light spilling from their windows, toward the voices of those they loved, toward a future they had claimed with courage and carved with care. The monster of Cedar Ridge had become a builder of bridges. The desperate widow had become a pillar of community. The frightened boy had grown into a child of many teachers, many traditions, and in their transformation lay proof of an eternal truth, that love, genuine and brave, could indeed remake the world. One heart, one family, one community at a time. In the last light, their shadows stretched long across the land they had made their own, not through conquest but through cultivation, not through exclusion but through embrace. And in those lengthening shadows was written the end of one story and the beginning of countless others, all springing from that moment when a woman had taken a wounded man's hand and spoken the words that changed everything. "I'm not afraid." Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening during your commute, relaxing at home, or perhaps on a long drive? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your feedback means the world to us, and I'd love to hear what touched you most about Elizabeth and Samuel's journey. Until next time, partners.